One of the most offensive claims in the Bible is the concept of sin. When people hear about sin, and when they hear about how evil we humans are in the sight of a holy God, most of us are pretty quick to reject it. We reject these ideas because we don't like being judged, we reject them because we want to be able to think highly of ourselves, and often we reject them because we just don't believe that they're true. We look at ourselves and think, I don't feel like a bad person. I don't think I do evil things. How could I possibly be so bad and not even know it? Let's look at an interaction recorded in the Bible that might enlighten us. One day, Jesus was speaking to a group of Abraham's descendants, people called the Jews, and Jesus was telling them that he was the promised one who came to save humans from their sins. At one point in this conversation, Jesus tells them that if they listen to him and follow him, then they'll have the truth, and that the truth will set them free. Upon hearing this, the crowd responds, "We're offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free?" Now it's time for a little history lesson. Abraham's descendants were slaves in Egypt as a people for over 400 years. And over the hundreds of years that followed, they were repeatedly abducted from their country and taken as slaves by different empires. In fact, at that very moment, the people that Jesus was talking to were living under the oppression of the occupying Roman forces. The Jews were a people who were literally defined by their experiences in slavery. But when Jesus told them that he would set them free, instead of trusting him, they denied that there was anything to save them from. So let's keep that in mind when we hear what happened next. Instead of pointing out to the crowd that they were lying straight to his face, Jesus responds by telling them that everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin, and he then shows them just how sinful they are. Now, if these people were blind to the physical evidence of their own enslavement all around them, do you think that they were able to see the sin and enslavement in their own hearts? And if these people knew as much about being enslaved as anyone could ever know, and they still couldn't see their own enslavement to sin, then do you really think that we can trust our own experiences and our own hearts and minds to tell us if we've been enslaved as well? It's a common idea that people are mostly good, and that when people do the wrong thing, it's just a sign that they don't have enough love, or enough education, or enough self-esteem. But that's not what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us that we sin because we are in fact slaves to sin. We sin because it's our nature. We sin not because of something outside of ourselves, but because of who we are inside. On top of this, the Bible tells us that sin has darkened our hearts and minds. So not only do we do what is sinful, but we even think that many of the sinful things that we do are good. That's probably not easy news to hear, especially when we live in a world that's constantly telling us the opposite. We're told over and over again that there's no greater purpose in life than to follow our hearts, to express who we are, and to be ourselves. But let's think about that for a second. We know which idea makes us feel better about ourselves, but which of these ideas does a better job of explaining what we see when we look at the world around us? When we look at how people treat each other around the world, we see oppression, injustice, hatred, war on a massive scale. When we look at how people feel about the state of things, we see that things like depression and loneliness and anxiety are just as common as they've ever been, and possibly even more so. This is the world that results when humans follow their own hearts. With all of its hatred and anger and selfishness, the world that we see outside of us is a reflection of what's inside of us, of who we are. Now, with that in mind, does it seem more likely that people are mostly good, and that we can all be happy and prosperous if we just be ourselves and let other people be themselves? Or does it seem more likely that at our core, humans are fallen, that we're sinful, and that we need something outside of ourselves to save us? Now, there's something I want to add here. It's possible that you've thought about things, looked at the world, and concluded, you know what, life isn't that difficult. Things aren't really so bad. And if you feel that way, then there's something I want you to consider. The number one reason people typically give for why they won't believe in God is the presence of evil and suffering in the world. Evil is something that's usually pretty easy for us to find, and for a lot of us, evil's especially easy to find when we're trying to blame God for it. If you've been troubled by evil in the world before, but now you suddenly can't find it when it might reveal something about you, then that's not a good sign. Now, I'm not going to say that you're blind if you don't believe what the Bible says, because that's a bit of a cop-out, even if it's true. But I can say this. If we see evil everywhere when we want to judge God for it, but then we can't find it when it might expose something about our own hearts, we sure sound a lot like the people that Jesus was speaking to, who denied the reality right in front of them when it became uncomfortable for them. And we sound just like a people who are enslaved and don't even know it. I painted a pretty bleak picture so far today. We're sinful in our very nature, we're suffering the consequences, and as slaves to sin, we have no hope to escape on our own. We need someone to set us free. But fortunately, that's exactly what God has done. By sending Jesus to die in our place, God has set us free from sin. If we trust that Jesus has saved us, then we're free from the guilt of our sin. If Jesus is our master, and His Spirit is in us, then sin is no longer master over us, and we are no longer slaves to it. And because Jesus will come again one day, we know that this sinful world will pass away and be no more. We don't tell you about sin because we like giving you bad news. We tell you about sin because once you know who you really are before God, then and only then will you really be able to understand the good news.